Hi, everybody. Welcome to Concept 2.2, the limitations of GDP. Let's get to it. Really, what we're looking at here is the critique, the legitimate critique of GDP or gross domestic product as a lead indicator. Does it make sense to focus all of our economic strategy and policy towards improving GDP if it has the shortcomings that we're going to discuss? And so that question really is left unanswered by, especially this class, by economists as a whole, but there is some significant progress in trying to improve our metrics and what we look towards. Let's get into it. So I love this cartoon because it really kind of describes what we're talking about here. It says business news. There's economic growth. Woo. Indicators, they're all up. Everything looks good. GDP is rising, but it's led by car repairs, divorce costs, open heart surgeries, and toxic waste cleanups. All of these things are associated with negative situations in a nation. But according to economics, it's all good, right? That's growth. More people have more income. GDP is rising. But maybe we should get a little more nuanced in what we're measuring to try and account for the well being of our population and our planet, not just growth and productivity. All right, so let's get into it. We have five major limitations. Limitation number one, we already talked about the exclusion of non market transactions. This is a critique of GDP because these non market transactions are really good. For example, when you give of your own service to a charity, right? You work at a soup kitchen, for example. You're not being paid a wage. You're not producing anything, and there's no market transaction, but it's a necessary element to kind of close the gaps in our economy that people can fall through, right? So that is not counted as a part of GDP, and so the nation as a whole isn't really incentivized to invest in those non-market transactions. Number two, the failure to account for income inequality. This is a big one. GDP itself just says, hey, our nation is healthy. If you're trying to get a better quality of life, you divide it by population and say, hey, our nation has this average salary, generally speaking. But neither of those things actually account for the fact that most of the income can be hoarded by the very, very wealthy, and the rest of us are left to fight among the scraps, right? So it doesn't account for that kind of nuanced layer. We really know that income distribution is really important for quality of life. You don't want just a few people to have a high quality of life. You want everybody to. The failure to indicate sustainability of growth. Like when we grow, are we overgrowing our resources? Are we overtaxing our resources? Are we working too hard for too long? Are we working the land too hard for too long? Are we falsely incentivizing these entrepreneurs? All of those things. Is it sustainable to grow at this rate? We all know that growth isn't necessarily a linear thing. Sometimes it goes up dramatically, sometimes it goes down. Is it sustainable given our resource capacity right now? GDP doesn't really help us understand that. This is a huge one, right? And this is probably the reason this has gained the most momentum. We're talking about environmental impact of a focus on production. Let's call it what it is. GDP is all about producing more. Produce more, that's economic growth. But producing more has real costs and consequences, right? If we produce more without any kind of measured understanding of what we're doing to our environment or what we're doing to the health of our people, then it's possible that we make irreversible damage to our planet and irreversible damage to our people. So that's really important to keep in mind. For example, whenever slave labor is used in the history of our world, whenever that happens, it results in GDP growth. But at what cost? The cost of human health? Like that's an astronomical cost for a boost in the GDP. Okay, so keep that in mind. And then the final one is we treat the replacement of depreciated capital the same as new capital. This is just saying the calculation is a little off, right? Remember, capital is a labor assist, which makes us more productive, which means GDP is increasing. All of those good things. But it's a little different when you're replacing a machine that broke down versus adding a new machine, right? If you have a sewing company and the sewing machine breaks, it breaks. And then you buy a new sewing machine to fix that, your productivity stays the same. But if you're a sewing company and you have one sewing machine and then you buy a brand new sewing machine, now I have two sewing machines. So I'm going to be more productive. GDP doesn't account for that nuance. Both of those are counted as capital and indicators for economic growth in the future. Okay, so clearly GDP has some limitations. There are some people working very, very hard at changing these metrics because you kind of hit what you're aiming for. That idea, if I'm aiming for more productivity or more production, I will. But if I'm aiming for human development, maybe I'll do that instead if that's truly our metric, right? So the dimensions of human development, or the HDI, the Human Development Index, takes things into account like long and healthy lives, knowledge, the understanding or a standard of living, right? What's their quality of life, participation in political and community life, environmental sustainability, human security and rights, promoting equality and social justice. All of these things come together to create a very nice development of the human that might be a little bit different, or maybe a lot of bit different than the results of a pursuit of GDP. Here's another one here. Let me move myself out of the way. Another one is called the Genuine Progress Indicator. All this does is it adjusts GDP to account for the environmental and social impact of it. And that gives us a better indicator of progress, right? Like, sure, we progress, but what do we do to human health and what do we do to environmental health when we have that progress? So, ideally, we want both of these lines to be going up. GDP goes up at the same time as GPI, meaning that, yes, we are growing and we're growing in a sustainable way. But as you can see here globally, in about the 90s, our GPI started to decrease while our GDP continued to increase. This is as some kind of dormant countries started being more industrialized and urbanized. And then in the United States, we see that happen a little bit earlier, about 90. Again, same idea, GDP is still going up, but we have to account for the consequences on our environment and the consequences on our people. And then you see in the UK, they had significant increase in GPI, significant dip because of austerity measures, which is where the government starts cutting all of their services to try and manage their finances a little bit better. But then you see growing together, a more sustainable growth model in the UK right now. Here's the final one. This is the Gross Happiness Index, GHI. Gross Happiness Index takes into account the well-being of people, life expectancy, the inequality, and then ecological footprint. And it uses those things to say, generally, this is how happy these nations are. Instead of saying productive, how about happy? And you see the United States is not super happy, but they're not super sad either. They're doing okay. Sub-Saharan Africa definitely has its struggles. Venezuela has its struggles. You'll see these common characters or actors time and time again. But Canada, a little happier than the United States. How about that? All right, moving on. Concept 2.3, unemployment. So remember, we have those goals. One of our goals is economic growth. We just talked about GDP and everything that goes with that. Goal number 2, keep unemployment low. In order to keep unemployment low, we have to understand what unemployment is and how we measure it. So the way that we measure unemployment, here we go, is we don't use population. We use a labor force. Here's why. Not everybody that's in the population actually wants to have a job or actually can have a job, right? So they're not counted as unemployed or employed because they don't want to be. So we have to first take out everyone in our population that's not counted, right? So that's senior citizens, that's children 16 and under, people who are institutionalized in hospitals or prisons, people who are demoralized, who wish they had a job but don't have a job right now. They're not counted as a part of the labor force. In fact, the labor force is anyone who actively wants a job, is actively pursuing a job, willing. So they're actively searching for it and they're able. They're able to actually do the job. So they're willing and able to work. Now that includes our unemployed, who are actively seeking employment but can't find it, and the employed, who actively sought employment and have it and maintain their jobs. So our labor force is just unemployed plus employed. Everybody else doesn't count, and that includes this list of people. The people that are counted, just talked about this, people who are able to work, people who are actively seeking employment. In the United States, our labor force is about 50% of our population. So if you think of that, that's a pretty small number, right? About 50% of our population has opted out of the workforce for a variety of reasons. Maybe they can't do it because they're kids, or they retired, so they self-selected out of it, or they decided to be a stay-at-home, fill in the blank, or they fall into one of those other categories. They're discouraged. They just can't get a job, so they opt out. So in the United States, in order to be counted as unemployed to get unemployed benefits, you have to file with the federal government. When you file, you have to prove that you are actively sending in applications to jobs. If you're not actively seeking employment, not only are you not counted as unemployed and you don't get those benefits, but also you're not counted as part of our labor force at all, right? You're out because you're no longer actively seeking employment. Okay, let's keep going. So unemployment rate itself is simply the number of unemployed divided by your labor force times 100. It's that simple, right? Now remember, our labor force is not our population. People get that wrong all the time. GDP per capita is GDP divided by population. Unemployed is unemployed divided by labor force, which is a much smaller number. Remember, labor force is unemployed plus employed. That gives you your labor force. Or if you're given the labor force participation rate, you can calculate it from there. For example, if they say 50% is our labor force participation rate, that means 50% of your population is in the labor force. So take your population, split it in half, and pop that labor force down in the denominator of this equation. Okay, so for example, if my labor force is 100, let me get a pen here. My labor force is 100, and I have 20 people that are unemployed. That means my unemployment rate is going to be 20%. So it's 20 divided by 100, which gives me 0.2 times 20%. Or I'm sorry, times 100, which gives me 20%. Kicks that over 2 spaces. It's that simple. If I have this information, how many people are employed? Actually, 80. 20 are unemployed. My labor force total is 100. I know 20 plus employed equals my labor force. So 20 plus 80 will equal 100. Okay, let's keep going. Now, one of the big critiques of unemployment is that it's understated, right? It actually should be worse than it actually is. And that's true. Here's the deal. 2 main faults. Fault number 1 is part-time employees are considered fully employed. Underemployed people are considered fully employed. So you could have 3 doctorate degrees, be trained as an astrophysicist, be highly, highly qualified, but working at McDonald's 3 hours a week. You're probably not happy. That's probably not the job you want. You're way overqualified for that job. But according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you are fully employed, right? So you do not count towards the unemployment rate. So there's no measurement for that underemployment. So the unemployment is understated. It should be worse than it actually is. In addition, many people, and we're seeing this right now, many people just aren't actively seeking a job because there aren't any jobs available. And so they become discouraged workers. They want a job, they just stop applying for jobs because it's a waste of time. They're not only not included in unemployment, but they're not a part of the labor force at all. So if you take both of these into account, the unemployment rate, whenever we see it, should actually be worse than it is. All right. So we need to know 3 types of unemployment down here. It's kind of hard to see with all these little things, but it says types of unemployment. There are 3 types that you need to know. The first is structural unemployment. Structural unemployment, it simply means that the structure of our economy has changed such that your skills, your talents, your abilities are obsolete. They're no longer valuable to our economy. So you can't find a job because the structure of our economy has decided your skill set isn't worthwhile anymore, which sounds really bad. And it actually is for the people this happens to. A great way to be able to detect structural unemployment or identify it is if the people who have lost their jobs have to get retrained or go back to school in order to be employable again, right? In other words, they have no skills that are able to be applied to the workforce. So a common one that we've experienced here in the United States is in the steel industry, right? Northeast Ohio, we had a ton of workers that were high school educated or less that were making good money, $40,000, $50,000 working in a factory without really having much skill beyond what they can do with their hands. And then all of those jobs started being offshored to cheaper labor, frankly. And as a result, those people lost their jobs. And they couldn't find another manufacturing job that paid them a similar wage. So in order to get reemployed, they had to get retrained or go back to school. That is structural unemployment. But here's the deal, my friends. Structural unemployment is seen as a good thing by economists. Another thing that makes them dismal. Why is it good? Our economy is restructuring on purpose for a reason. They're restructuring in order to better meet the needs and wants of their population. right? So they're better solving scarcity by restructuring our economy all of the time. So we want some of this unemployment. Is it painful? Yes. But it shows that our economy is functioning and adjusting, reallocating our resources to things that are actually in need. Is there lag time between that? Yes. Is it painful? Yes. Is it good for our economy in the long run? Also, yes. Okay, so that's structural unemployment. Second one is frictional unemployment. Frictional unemployment is something you will experience or have experienced, right? You have new training, you get done with high school, now you're qualified for new jobs, or you get done with college and now you're qualified for new jobs. But you're not just going to take the first job that you get, you're going to start a job hunt, which means that you're going to find a bunch of places that are willing to hire you, and then you're going to pick the best job for you. In other words, there's friction between jobs, right? So I have this job, I have new qualifications, other people want me. I'm going to be unemployed for a little bit. I'm actively searching. I want a job, I'm able to work, but I don't have a job right now because I'm waiting. It's called the search and wait unemployment. This is considered a very, very good thing. It means that people are investing in their human capital, and that means they're going to be more productive. So we like frictional unemployment. We actually want frictional unemployment. It means our economy is healthy. We're investing in human capital. Our final one is cyclical unemployment, and it's the bad one. Cyclical unemployment means you have skills that people want. It's not structural. You are highly qualified and people want to hire you, right? So it's not frictional. And you want the job. It's not frictional. The only reason you don't have a job is because people stop buying stuff. It's caused by a decrease in total spending. Our economy has decided to save their money rather than spend it, which causes the recession. The circular flow starts to fade. There's tons of leakage. And now businesses just can't afford to keep everybody there. And so they downsize, they lay people off, they fire people. And now you are unemployed simply because the business can't afford to keep you. That's the bad stuff. That's critical. That means our economy is broken. It's not functional. So that's cyclical unemployment. So you can actually take these and come up with a full employment number. Most people think fully employed means 0% unemployment rate. That's not true. You know that there are two good unemployments that we actually want that mean our economy is healthy. We want frictional unemployment, that friction between jobs. I have new training, new abilities, new qualifications. People want me. I'm going to find the best job. And you have structural unemployment. The economy is restructuring. Sure, I have to get more training, but I'm going to be trained in something that actually meets the needs and wants of our population. So we take those two percentages, we add them together, and that is our full employment rate. That's where we want to be. That's our target unemployment rate, right? So, for example, if my frictional unemployment is 2% and my structural unemployment is 3%, then my full employment is going to be 5%, which is full employment. Now, what if my actual unemployment rate was 8%? What's that mean? Well, if I know my full employment is 5%, which is frictional plus structural, then that extra 3% of unemployment, that's critical, that's cyclical unemployment. Okay, let's keep going. Unemployment leads to a lot of social consequences. We've talked about this already, but unemployment leads to family disintegration, loss of morale, violence, health risk, political change and upheaval, loss of skill, ethnic tension. You see this list and you look at what's happening in our society right now and you nod your head. Yes, unemployment does result, or at least is correlated with all of these negative consequences. So there is significant effort in trying to keep unemployment as low as possible, even when we're in the deepest of deep recessions like we are right now. Okay, there's shows the trend between unemployment rate and crime rates per capita. As you can see, that changing, kind of lags behind, but it follows, reflects it. That's it. You got two Khan Academies for this, 2.2, 2.3, on the limitations of GDP and unemployment at khanacademy.com. Keep in mind, 4 questions long, significantly more difficult than normal, but that's on purpose. Okay, just do your best, forget the rest. Have a great day. Talk to you soon.